And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. And entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment. And he saith unto them, Be not affrighted. Ye seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Mark 16:2.
The resurrection of Jesus, celebrated throughout the world at Easter. But the Christ's journey to his ultimate destiny actually began here in the Galilee. In these hills, by these shores, this timeless landscape bears witness to the ministry of the young teacher who lived 2,000 years ago. An ancient city named Sepphoris, a thriving metropolis in the time of Jesus, yet the Bible makes no mention of this population center, just an hour's walk from his home, Nazareth.
For someone familiar with the topography and the lay of the land of Lower Galilee, when he or she picks up the Gospels, the absence of Sepphoris shouts at you.
It is 1986. The Galilee reluctantly yields a priceless treasure, an ancient wooden boat which sailed these waters in the time of Christ. Could this be the craft that once carried Jesus and his apostles? What other secrets may reside in these hills where Jesus once taught? What more can the Galilee reveal of Jesus and his message? These are but a few of the mysteries of the Bible. Israel, promised land of the Jews, sacred place of the Arabs, cradle of Christianity. Here, 2,000 years ago, lived a man called Jesus. The life of Jesus was a brief 33 years, and of those, only 3 are chronicled in the New Testament. Those years were largely spent here, in the northern region of the Holy Land, known as the Galilee. Precious little evidence exists to reconstruct a portrait of the historical Jesus.
We have no information about the infancy, birth of Jesus, any more than we have about the adolescence or young years. It all starts with the public life.
Any new evidence is likely to be unearthed here in the Galilee, and it may be found by retracing the footsteps of the immortal teacher. The Bible telling of his story begins in the earliest days of the Christian calendar. The Holy Land is ruled by the Romans.
It came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and of the lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. Luke 2:1. And so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. Luke 2:6.
The world into which Jesus is born is enjoying the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, but a politically uneasy peace it is. Beneath the deceptive veneer, the Holy Land under Herod the Great is seething with discontent, particularly in the Jewish population. Herod lives in constant fear of revolt. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that upon hearing rumors of the birth of the Messiah, Herod decides to eliminate this threat. Unable to single out the Christ child, he orders that all children in and around Bethlehem that are under the age of 2 be killed. The Bible tells us that many infants are murdered that night. Although no other historical source refers to this event, it will forever be known as the slaughter of the innocents. Joseph, warned in a dream by an angel, takes Mary and the infant Jesus out of Bethlehem and into the land of the Pharaohs. The little family remains in Egypt for a year, saving Jesus from what would have been certain death. We now return to the Galilee. Joseph, back from Egypt, settles his family in Nazareth, a small, obscure country village. What becomes of the babe and his parents at this time is not known. There are no written accounts.
We can only surmise, and I think it's safe basically to do this, what his life would have been like during those years. And based on our reconstructions of Galilee, we can see that he would have probably apprenticed with his family. He would have learned a skill. He would have started to form his opinions and his judgments that are given expression in the Gospels.
And so a young Galilean boy grows up on his way to an inexorable destiny. This is the Church of St. Gabriel in Nazareth. Jesus might have played on this ground as a boy. Since the Gospels themselves remain largely silent about the young Jesus, what can we know about this stage of his development?
When I envision Jesus of Nazareth, I see a simple Galilean Jew who had a very traditional upbringing in a small hamlet, Nazareth, where there was a Jewish community, whose first language was Aramaic and Hebrew, and as a young adult learned Greek to the extent that he could use it in marketplace.
When we next meet Jesus, he is 30 years old and about to embark on the central drama of his life. We are back in the ageless hills of the Galilee. In continuing to track his footsteps, the only direct sources are the 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first 4 books of the New Testament. In 1945, however, all this seems to change with a dramatic discovery at Nag Hammadi in Egypt's Nile Valley. It is possibly a 5th Gospel, the Book of Thomas, and it stuns the world. The original 4 Gospels were written at least 40 years after the death of Christ. The newly discovered Book of Thomas, however, seems likely to have been written earlier. Could it be what the Gospels are not? An eyewitness account?
Because the Gospel of Thomas has no narrative in it, doesn't say anything about the crucifixion or the resurrection. It assumes that Jesus is alive. It talks about Jesus as a living one, and then just makes of his importance, namely these things he said.
While its authenticity is still open to question, the Book of Thomas does give us a Jesus who seems less apocalyptic than the Jesus of the 4 Gospels. In Thomas, he is more of a gentle teacher of wisdom. In Thomas, Jesus seems more occupied with each individual's inner spiritual odyssey.
His disciples said to him, "When will the kingdom come? It will not come by watching for it. It will not be said, 'Behold here,' or 'Behold there.' Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it." Thomas 1:13.
Look into our own hearts, Jesus seems to be telling us. But at this point in his life, the beginning of his ministry in the Galilee, Jesus' path will cross another, and it is the original Gospels which provide the telling.
And it came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized of John in the Jordan. Mark 1:9.
In meeting the Baptist for the first time, Jesus is exposed to a radical political philosophy, a philosophy which may signify the first steps he would take on his way to the cross.
The only other messianic prophet, if you use that term, at the time of Jesus that we know of was John the Baptist. And what John the Baptist was doing, of course, was bringing people out into the desert, taking them through the Jordan, back into the Promised Land. He was reenacting the Exodus conquest. That was terribly, terribly subversive. What he was doing was planting ticking time bombs of apocalyptic expectation all over the Jewish homeland.
After the baptism, Jesus, like John and so many prophets before him, sets off for the wilderness. He is about to have a profound spiritual experience alone in the desert. This is Quarantal, northwest of Jericho. To Christians, it is the Mount of Temptation. It is here that Jesus spent 40 days and nights fasting and praying. It is here that Jesus is confronted by the devil, who beckons to him from the dark side. Jesus is tempted 3 times, and 3 times he resists. This cleansing frees him to begin his ministry and completes his break with the Baptist. In the 4th century, a Byzantine monastery commemorating the site was built into the mountain on the remains of a Roman fort. Jesus, having resisted the temptation, leaves the wilderness and returns to the fertile hills and abundant waters of the Galilee. In fact, an extraordinary number of the tellings in the New Testament from this point forward involve images of water. It is 1986 and Israel is parched by drought. 2 brothers are drawn to the receding waters of the Galilean Sea. Unbeknownst to them, they are about to make a startling find: an ancient boat dating back to the time of Jesus. Could this waterlogged wood have survived all those centuries? Is there any connection between this boat and the wise, charismatic teacher from the Galilee? Our investigation continues with the boat of the Galilee when we return with Mysteries of the Bible.
And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw 2 brethren, Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he saith unto them, Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And they straightway left their nets and followed him. Mark 1:16.
The Gospels often refer to water and boats and to images of seafarers. In 1986, in a dramatic moment, the Gospels and their references to water seem suddenly to come to life. The Holy Land is in the clutches of a severe drought, and the waters of the Galilee are the lowest they have been in memory. At a small farming village on the Sea of Galilee, just 2 miles north of the timeless city of Tiberias, 2 brothers make a startling discovery. Immediately, they contact Dr. Shelley Waxman, curator of antiquities at the nearby museum at Genesar. At the site, Waxman and his crew begin a meticulous search through the mud, looking for a sign of the ancient craft.
They had sort of moved the mud away from the top of the planking, and I cleaned off a small area of about 15 centimeters, and there were mortise and tenon joints. We knew immediately it's an ancient boat.
Waxman and his crew are awed by their find. It is the first ancient wreck ever discovered in the Sea of Galilee. a boat dating back to the time of Christ, which actually plied these waters and then survived the centuries.
Now it came to pass on a certain day that he went into a ship with his disciples. But as they sailed, he fell asleep. And there came down a storm of wind on the lake, and they were filled with water and were in jeopardy. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, "Master, Master, we perish." Then he arose and rebuked the wind and the raging water, and they ceased, and there was a calm. And he said unto them, "Where is your faith?" And they, being afraid, wondered, saying to one another, "What manner of man is this? For he commandeth even the winds and the water." Luke 8:22.
In an eerie moment, a sudden downpour interrupts the unearthing of the boat.
And we suddenly had this tremendous rainstorm. We all ran for the Jeep. And when we came out of the Jeep, there was this beautiful double rainbow cascading into the Sea of Galilee.
A frenzy of activity follows the boat's discovery. Experts and digging teams are assembled on short notice. Now it is a race against time, a race against the rising waters of the Galilee. Project leader Waxman calls on the authorities to lower the level of the sea to preserve the site. Construction begins immediately on a barrier to hold the rising Galilean waters at bay. As the boat makes its shape known, two artifacts are recovered from the mud, a small jar and an oil lamp. These objects place the boat in or near the 1st century when Jesus was born.
Simon Peter saith unto them, "I go a-fishing." They say unto him, "We also go with thee." They went forth and entered into a ship immediately. And that night they caught nothing. But when the morning was now come, Jesus stood on the shore, and he said unto them, "Cast the net on the right side of the ship, and ye shall find." They cast therefore, and now they were not able to draw it for the multitude of fishes. John 21:3.
Simon Peter decides to go fishing, and he takes with him 6 disciples, making a rowing crew of 5, plus people to help with the net. So altogether, all those descriptions of boats are talking about the same type of boat.
Historical confirmation of the boat's shape can be found nearby in the ruin at Migdal, or Magdala, a few miles north of Tiberias. It is a time-worn mosaic which depicts a boat similar to the newly discovered craft. And so it is that a short 14 days after its discovery, the precious boat of the Galilee, cocooned in space-aged plastic, sets sail for the first time in 2,000 years. Scholars are left to ponder what mysteries the boat may help solve when it is lifted from its restorative bath. Since the boat sailed the Galilee in the days when Jesus taught and preached here, will it provide new insight into those times? And what of those early days in the 1st century? Some scholars are puzzled by the Bible's description of life in the Galilee. Historical evidence seems to be at odds with what the Gospels tell us. When we return, life, death, and taxes in the days of Jesus on Mysteries of the Bible. The River Jordan, river of history and fable, river of the Holy Land. In the south, the Jordan flows into the Dead Sea, the saltiest, most lifeless body of water on earth. In the north, 200 miles away, the Jordan springs from one of the most bountiful freshwater lakes anywhere, the Sea of Galilee. Today, the sun-splashed Galilee is a playground, a land of tourists and travelers. The fields along the Jordan are rich with crops. It is a modern, efficient region with resorts dotting the seasides. But the Gospels paint quite a different picture of the Galilee 2,000 years ago. In the Gospels, the Galilee is a pastoral place. The bustle of a big city like Jerusalem must have been quite a contrast to the towns which embroider the story of Jesus, towns like Nazareth, Cana, and Capernaum. Archaeologists, however, are finding a Galilee which seems to be in conflict with the Gospel's gentle description.
Archaeology, certainly over the last decade, has raised a number of questions. Help us reconfigure Galilee. It's no longer the romantic, pastoral, agrarian world that so many people heard about in Sunday school. People walking around with lambs on their shoulders along in the tall hills. No, this is a bustling, urbanized, developed place. Archaeology has taught us that.
If this new, more urban description is an accurate portrait of the times, we are left with a lingering question. Why would Jesus turn away from the population centers in the middle of the Holy Land and head for the sleepy villages and seaside towns in the north? Did Jesus instinctively turn away from the Romans in the cities?
The Roman Empire was in a boom economy, and boom economies, as we know from America in the 80s, are not always good for everyone. They were very good for the elites and the aristocrats. The empire was commercializing. The aristocrats were probably taking over more and more land. That meant more and more debt for the peasantry, and that meant more and more land being expropriated. Jesus is speaking to that situation, and he is declaring in the name of the kingdom of God that that's not the way God wants the world run. He is declaring that this system, this structure, is unjust.
Jesus was not speaking in a vacuum. The Romans were an unforgiving occupying force, and each individual in the largely Jewish population would weigh this new message for him or herself.
Any attempt to understand the social and political environment in which Jesus was born needs to keep in mind two things which was on every Jew's mind in the first century. First of all, how much of our Judaism do we have to give up, or do we want to give up in order to be a part of the modern world? And secondly, what is our attitude going to be about the fact that Roman soldiers have been on the territory now for 100 years?
The known world in the first century of the Common Era is filled with surprising developments and great leaps forward for mankind. The world's population stands at 250 million. In China, cast iron is first used as a structural material, and the Chinese build bridges which allow heavy carts to carry goods from province to province. In the forming countries of the European continent, the saddle is introduced, changing forever man's relationship with the horse as a means of transportation. To the south, domesticated camels take their first steps through the shifting sands of the Great Sahara. The newly tamed beast of burden allows man to cross deserts and open new trade routes. The Romans understand armed confrontation. What must seem far more threatening is the peaceful resistance Jesus preaches, and faith in a power greater than the Romans, greater than any on earth.
Jesus and his followers were part in some way of a movement that sought to change the structures in Lower Galilee in the first century. I also think that Jesus was of the opinion that he and his group could contribute significantly to how Lower Galilee could be run.
When questioned by the crowds about taxes, a hot political issue of the day, Jesus answered them in this way.
Bring me a penny that I may see it. Whose is this image and superscription? And they said unto him, Caesar's. And Jesus answering said unto them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Mark 12:15.
Jesus is not capitulating to the Romans. Rather, he is asking the people to set aside material things. Those things, Jesus seemed to be saying, are Caesar's. They belong to the Romans. They have little to do with what is of essence to God.
Taxes in and of themselves are not a problem. It's when the people living, let us say, in Lower Galilee perceive their share of the taxes to be unfair. Neither Judaism nor Christianity ultimately chose revolution as a means to express their piety and their faith. The local indigenous population was divided over a host of issues: political, religious, economic. And these different fragmented groups sought for leaders, sought for help, sought for guidance. And they looked for a leader whom they thought God had touched in some way to lead them out of this malaise, which seems to characterize Galilee in this period. Jesus was one such leader.
Living with oppression, turning the other cheek, tolerance, forgiveness, love of one's enemies. It may be merely coincidence that the ages of violence that culminated in Roman oppression also culminated in these immortal teachings. Or maybe not. But the mystery of the Galilee and what kind of place it truly was in the time of Jesus persists. It is now 1931. An excavation begins here at Sepphoris, not 3.5 miles from Nazareth, the boyhood home of Jesus. From historical and archaeological accounts, scholars extrapolate that Sepphoris had about 20,000 inhabitants in Jesus' day. What puzzles them is that the Bible makes no mention of Sepphoris, which was a vibrant city less than an hour's walk from where Jesus grew up. Could Jesus possibly have lived so close by and never have visited the city? What secrets of the man of Galilee might we find in these particular layers of civilization? When we come back, the silence of Sepphoris. In the autumn of his 30th year, Jesus and his mother are invited to a wedding celebration in the town of Cana. Lying inland from the Sea of Galilee, Cana is considerably larger than tiny Nazareth, 8 miles to the south. Significantly, it is not as large as the nearby city of Sepphoris.
And there were set there 6 water pots of stone, after the manner of purifying the Jews. And Jesus saith unto them, Draw out now, and bear unto the governor of the feast. When the ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, he knew not whence it came. He called the bridegroom, and saith unto him, Thou hast kept the good wine until now. John 2:6.
Thus, according to John, Jesus begins his public life with a nod to the Greek god of the vine. At the time, the act of changing water to wine was seen by many as a charlatan's trick. Of all the physical miracles, why would Jesus choose this one to begin his ministry?
What's important about that is when you look at the Galilee, you have Dionysus as a major figure that is revered. Part of the reason for that is that wine was one of the main staples of the Mediterranean diet. And if your deity could not produce wine or be involved in the production of wine, he wasn't much of a deity.
According to tradition, this church, the Church of the Miracles, marks the site of the wedding feast where Jesus changed water to wine. Why would Jesus have chosen Cana to begin his work? Why not an even larger city, a population center, like nearby Sepphoris, which was barely 3.5 miles from Nazareth? And equally puzzling, why do the Gospels make no mention of the busy metropolis? Why is the Bible silent on Sepphoris?
For someone familiar with the topography and the lay of the land of Lower Galilee, when he or she picks up the Gospels, the absence of Sepphoris shouts at you. Or one of the other large cities also in Lower Galilee during the first century. Where are these places? And why doesn't the movement go through them? Spend some time in them. In fact, these cities are unavoidable. You'd have to walk through them to go from one village to another. This remains a mystery.
When Herod Antipas was building this city, it would have brought in people from all the environs. It would have certainly involved the people of Nazareth to some extent. That it is not mentioned in the Gospels or anywhere in the New Testament is surely significant.
This is the site where Sepphoris stood in the time of Jesus. Originally built in the Persian era, it was taken over and rebuilt by the Romans in 70 BCE. It was destroyed once again in an uprising against Herod the Great, and his son, Herod Antipas, would rebuild Sepphoris in 4 BCE. From that time forward, Sepphoris was continually inhabited until 1940. The city sits on a high promontory with the Mediterranean to the west and the Sea of Galilee to the east. Medieval pilgrims revered Sepphoris as the birthplace of St. Anne and Mary, the mother of Jesus. Crusaders built a church to St. Anne, presumably over the spot where she lived with Joachim, her husband, and Mary, her daughter. On the one hand, it is difficult to imagine Jesus spending 30 years of his life so close by in Nazareth and never visiting his mother's birthplace. On the other hand, it is conceivable that Jesus stayed away from Sepphoris because he would not have found a sympathetic ear in this Roman stronghold.
Within about 25 years in Lower Galilee, 2 cities were built. Sepphoris was rebuilt around 4 BCE after the death of Herod the Great, and Tiberias was built as its rival and almost replacement around, say, 19 to 20 of the Common Era. So within 25 years, you have 2 major cities in Lower Galilee, in a very small area. The building of cities is not good news for peasants.
Ancient Sepphoris was set out in a Roman grid pattern with a bustling marketplace, a huge amphitheater, and splendid palaces. Archaeological excavations began in 1931 and continue to this day.
It's very likely that the villagers, that the peasants, that the people that lived in Galilee went to Sepphoris to sell their ware, went to Sepphoris to buy other people's ware, and it's therefore quite plausible, though it can't be proven, that Jesus himself, as a carpenter, would have visited Sepphoris at some time or another.
Did Jesus walk these streets? The hopes of finding clues to the physical Jesus compel researchers to dig deeper and faster through the ruins of this ancient city. But the silence of Sepphoris is a mystery which endures to this day. Leaving behind the high, dry plains, Jesus sets off for Capernaum, a fishing village on the Sea of Galilee with some 2,000 souls. It is here the significant part of the ministry of Jesus begins, in Capernaum, Bethany, and the surrounding hills. Today, at the shores of Capernaum, fishermen still ply the waters of the fertile Galilee as they did in ancient days, harvesting a local delicacy called St. Peter's fish. The tiny town is a ruin now, silent testimony to the wondrous words and works of Jesus. Since 1894, Franciscan fathers have stood guard over the ruin of Capernaum, over the rubble and stones where Jesus first started to convey his message to the people.
Jesus didn't tell people what to do. The impact of his stories was to draw people into the stories, and if they could hear the stories, if they could see the reality that he was talking about, they would know what to do.
The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. Once it is sown, it springs up and becomes greater than all plants. Mark 4:31. It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Mark 10:25.
The words of Jesus seem to echo through this beautifully preserved white limestone synagogue dating back to 300 CE. It sits on top of an older structure made of black basalt, which is native to the region. It is believed this early synagogue is the place where Jesus once taught. It is also in Capernaum, according to Mark, that Jesus heals for the first time. He approaches the mother-in-law of Peter and raises her from paralysis. In fact, so much of the Gospels are centered at Capernaum that scholars debate whether this was actually Jesus' headquarters and whether his wanderings through the Galilee, his itinerancy, are greatly exaggerated.
I think the itinerancy of the Jesus movement is much overblown. In fact, the gospel tradition depicts the movement as rather settled. And one must remember, and this is frequently overlooked, the Lower Galilee is so small that one could wake up with the sun, journey to a town, make people angry, and be back for bedtime easily.
One of the interesting features of Jesus' ministry is what I call his itinerancy, his on the move all the time. A moving network is far harder to find, to locate, and to destroy. And that's part of his power. It is not fixed in one place with one group that the Romans could hit once and for all and finish.
During the 3 years of his public life, Jesus often wanders from the Sea of Galilee to the hills whose names inspire the poetry of the Gospels. Mount Tabor, Mount of the Leap, Golgotha. He leaves not a footprint or a scrap of cloth on the landscape of the Galilee. The saga of Jesus in the Galilee continues with a question, another mystery to be examined. Why is it that the central moments of his ministry occur on the mountaintops, in the high places of the Galilee? And why is his message not widely accepted in those early days? When we return, the Mount of the Leap and the rejection of Jesus are mysteries of the Bible.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Matthew 5:3.
These are the words of Jesus the Christ, as set down in the poetry of Matthew. These blessings, spoken on a mountaintop, are known as the Beatitudes. Of the 5 most significant sermons given by Jesus in his short, brilliant ministry, these are the center points of his teachings. This is the Mount of the Beatitudes. Although the church which stands here was only built in 1936, it is believed this is the spot where Jesus gave us the Beatitudes, which are part of the Sermon on the Mount.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:9.
Matthew takes all sorts of sayings of Jesus, puts Jesus on a mountain like a new Moses, and gives a Sermon on the Mount, which is like a new Mount Sinai. Mark doesn't know anything about that. John doesn't know anything about that. That's Matthew's way of condensing it into one marvelous vision of Jesus as a new Moses. So there's no point in going looking for a mountain on which Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount, though of course if you do go to Galilee, they will show you a place, and that's where you can imagine the Sermon on the Mount.
Yet man has always found solace and inspiration in the heights. Lofty peaks and grand vistas fill the soul with wonder. It seems perfectly possible that Jesus would have gone to the heights to impart his message. This is Mount Tabor, shrouded in mystical meanings, a legendary place of the Spirit.
And after 6 days, Jesus taketh with him Peter and James and John, and leadeth them up into a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow. And Peter answered and said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. Mark 9:2.
The high mystic places in the Galilee are places of triumph in the Bible, but mysteriously they are also the settings for the great tragedies in the life of Jesus. Of the 4 Gospels, only Luke includes a mysterious incident in his brief public life. The telling begins as Jesus goes to worship in the synagogue in the hills of Nazareth. When handed the lessons to read, he chooses the words of Isaiah, prophesying the coming of the Messiah. Jesus implies that he is the chosen one of Isaiah's message. The spot where this occurred is known as the Mount of the Leap.
And all they in the synagogue, when they heard these things, were filled with wrath, and rose up, and thrust him out of the city, and led him unto the brow of the hill whereon their city was built, that they might cast him down headlong. Luke 4:28.
Was Jesus cast off a hillside by his own townspeople? And if so, is there a lesson meant to be learned?
I think the biggest mystery of Jesus' life was the fact that he failed. The fact that he came to announce the arrival of God's kingdom. He came to announce a gracious and loving God at the center of human life, and people could not accept it. So the mystery is intertwined with our failure to respond. And I use our in the generic sense of human beings. It's not a question of assigning blame to any particular group or any particular people, as has sometimes been done in Christian history against the Jews, but simply of saying that the possibility of human transformation, the possibility of really envisioning a new way of relating in human life to one another, of overcoming enmity through loving enemies, for example, was rejected. And it seems to me that whatever else salvation means, it means the transformation of human life. It means that we overcome the realities in our lives that alienate us from one another, that create enmities, that create hatred and suspicion. I think this is what Jesus wanted to do.
Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Matthew 5:6.
This hallowed land, this Galilee, this land of contrast, land of thirst and bountiful springs, land of fertile valleys pierced by lofty heights, a sea of bounty and of mystery. The message Jesus brought as a dynamic challenge 2,000 years ago reaches out across the ages as a clarion call from a timeless place of history, a timeless place of mystery, still known as the Galilee.